Today, we're diving into one of history's most frustrating and just fascinating manhunts. This is the story of the Nazi who got away.
It really all boils down to one massive question, a question that haunted survivors and Nazi hunters for decades. How on earth did Josef Mengele, the man they called the Angel of Death at Auschwitz, just disappear?
You know, funny enough, the end of this story is actually our beginning. Picture this, June 6, 1985. A team of investigators in Brazil is digging up a grave. The headstone reads Wolfgang Gerhardt, but they had a strong suspicion that the coffin actually held the remains of a man responsible for some of the most monstrous crimes in human history.
To really understand this decades-long chase, you have to understand the two men at the very center of it all, the monster and the hunter.
So on one side, you've got Josef Mengele. He was a German doctor, an SS officer, and the heir to a pretty wealthy family business. And on the other side, Simon Wiesenthal, a Jewish architect from Poland. When Hitler came to power, their lives went down two completely opposite paths. Mengele, well, he became a key player in a genocide. Wiesenthal became a survivor who lost almost his entire family, and he would dedicate the rest of his life to hunting men just like Mengele.
For 21 months, Mengele was a physician at Auschwitz, and as trains packed with prisoners arrived, he would stand on the platform, almost casually, pointing people to the right, which meant a miserable life of slave labor, or to the left, which meant immediate death in the gas chambers. A survivor once called him a charming dancing master leading a ballet of death. It just shows you the chilling, almost casual nature of his evil.
But Mengele didn't just select people for death. Oh no. He selected them for his so-called research. He was completely obsessed with this twisted Nazi science of racial purity, and he ended up murdering an estimated 3,000 twins in his sadistic medical experiments. To him, they were just perfect test subjects, a way to unlock the genetic secrets to building his Aryan master race.
This quote from survivor Ava Moses, it's just brutal. After he injected her with some kind of toxic chemical, Mengele just laughed and told her she had 2 weeks to live. Incredibly, she refused to die and she survived, but her story just lays bare the kind of intimate, personal cruelty he was capable of. Human lives were just disposable props for his horrific work.
So when the war finally ended and the full horror of the concentration camps came to light, you'd think a guy this notorious would be public enemy number one. So how did he just vanish?
Well, it was really a combination of chaos, a bit of dumb luck, and a whole network of support. First, he ditched his SS uniform and just surrendered to the Americans. Now, almost all SS officers had this blood type tattoo in their armpit, but for whatever reason, Mengele never got one, so they just let him go. After that, he hid out in his home region, working as a farmhand, while his family played dumb with Allied investigators. And finally, with help from what was called the Ratlines, a whole network of Nazi sympathizers smuggling fugitives out of Europe, he got to Italy, got a fake Red Cross passport, and by 1949 he was on a ship to Argentina.
But his escape to South America wasn't the end of it. Actually, for a while, he barely even tried to hide. And this next chapter is just a frustrating story of so many near misses and blown opportunities.
This is pretty incredible. In Argentina, under the protection of Juan Perón's regime, Mengele felt so safe that he lived right out in the open. He ran a small business paid for by his family back in Germany, and get this, he even used his real name at the West German embassy. The arrogance is just stunning. But he was helped by a whole network of fellow Nazi fugitives and friendly embassy clerks. But the net finally started to close in the late 50s. Thanks to Simon Wiesenthal's relentless work, West Germany issued an arrest warrant in 1959. But someone, probably at the embassy, tipped Mengele off, and he fled to Paraguay. Then, just a year later, Mossad pulls off that legendary kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires. And here's the craziest near miss. Their intel showed Mengele was hanging out at a safe house just nearby. They had him located, but at the last minute they decided to call off a second kidnapping.
So why? Why didn't they grab him when they had the chance? Well, the head of Mossad at the time, Isser Harel, he made a strategic call. He was convinced that trying to capture Mengele would put the main mission, getting Eichmann to Israel for trial, in jeopardy. It was the pragmatic choice, you could say, but it was the one that let the angel of death slip through their fingers yet again.
And after that close call, Mengele knew his days of living out in the open were over. He went deep, deep underground. He became a paranoid fugitive, a ghost, really, whose legend was fueled by all kinds of myths and rumors.
For the next 20 years, basically nothing. The trail just went completely cold. He bounced between Paraguay and Brazil, living this quiet, isolated life as a farm manager, always protected by that network of sympathizers who didn't ask a lot of questions. He became a man living in constant fear of that knock on the door.
And you know, when there's no real information, these fantastic stories start to bubble up. There was this tale of a beautiful Mossad agent who set a honey trap for him and was later found dead. A Brazilian cop claimed he'd personally shot and killed him. Every so often, some grainy 3-second-long photo would pop up. But the reality was, most of these were just stories, fakes, and they turned him into this almost mythical, untouchable boogeyman.
And that brings us right back to where we started, 1985. After all those decades of false leads and dead ends, the case was finally about to crack wide open. But it led to a conclusion that was, well, anything but satisfying.
So the big breakthrough didn't happen in South America. It happened in Mengele's own hometown in Germany. The police raided the home of a family friend, and they found this treasure trove of letters. And these letters pointed them to a very specific place, a little town in Brazil called Embu, and the grave of a man named Wolfgang Gerhard.
But they needed proof, like indisputable 100% proof. So an international team of forensic scientists got to work. They used old photographs to compare the skull structure, they checked dental records, and then the final confirmation came from DNA analysis. And the conclusion was definitive. The skeleton in that grave was Josef Mengele. The hunt was finally over.
And the final piece of this whole puzzle came from Mengele's own son, Rolf. He dropped an absolute bombshell. He confirmed he knew his father was dead, and he revealed the pretty mundane truth behind this huge legend. Turns out, back in 1979, 6 years before they even dug up the body, this 68-year-old Mengele had a stroke while he was swimming at a beach and just drowned.
For Simon Wiesenthal, the news was bittersweet, to say the least. He had to accept that the man at the very top of his list, the man behind so much pain, would never stand trial in a human court. And this quote from him really gets to the heart of why this mattered so much. It was never just about catching one guy. It was about holding pure evil accountable.
So Josef Mengele escaped justice. He died a free man, technically, but for the last decades of his life, he lived like a ghost, constantly looking over his shoulder, afraid of every single shadow. Which leaves us with this one last lingering question. He might have cheated the courts, but was a life lived in constant, paranoid fear its own kind of prison?